the Dakota wind has a voice, and on that day it spoke of teeth. Out on the edge of the world where the prairie grass bowed to the black hills, a young woman named Elspeth Monroe lived with the ghosts of her parents, and the grit of the frontier lodged deep under her fingernails. She believed she understood the laws of this land, the honesty of the soil, the cruelty of the blizzard, and the swift justice of a well-aimed rifle. But she was about to learn that the most dangerous predators don't always walk on four legs, and that a single act of courage can ignite a firestorm that threatens to burn everything you know to the ground. The cabin stood like a stubborn boulder against the endless sea of grass. Hewn from pine by her father's hands, its timbers were stained dark by years of sun and snow. For Elspeth Monroe, all of 18 years old, it was the entire world. Her father, a stoic Scotsman named Angus Monroe, had taught her the language of the land. He taught her to read a storm in the color of the sky, to track a deer by a single bent blade of grass, and to trust the heft of the Winchester 73 that now rested above the hearth. Her mother Maria had taught her the language of the heart, how to find beauty in a prairie rose, how to soothe a fever with willow bark tea, and how to fight the encroaching loneliness with a steady hand and a resilient spirit. They were gone now, both taken by the lung fever. 2 winters passed, leaving Elspeth in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her 20-acre claim, the sturdy cabin, the hand-dug well, the small barn where her mule Barnaby snorted contentedly, and the vegetable patch that was her testament to hope. This particular afternoon in late autumn, the air had a brittle edge to it. The sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of pale blue, and the wind, a constant companion, whispered warnings through the eaves of the cabin. Elspeth was splitting wood, the rhythmic thump-crack of her axe, a lonely heartbeat in the vastness. Each swing was a testament to her survival. Her hands, though slender, were calloused and strong. Her face, framed by a braid of sun-bleached blonde hair that refused to stay tidy, was tanned and freckled, her blue eyes narrowed with a perpetual watchfulness. She paused, leaning on the axe handle, and scanned the horizon. To the east, the prairie rolled into eternity. To the west, the Pahasapa. The black hills rose like a slumbering giant, their pine-covered slopes already dusted with the first hint of snow. It was Sioux, land sacred land. Her father had respected that. "We're guests here, Elsie," he'd always said. "Don't matter what some paper in Washington says. We're guests. You treat the host with respect, even if you never see him." It was a lesson that set the Monroes apart from the other settlers trickling into the territory, men with hard eyes and a hunger for gold and grass. Men like Hiram Gantry, who ran the dusty outpost of Dust Devil Creek, a settlement 10 miles south. Gantry saw the Lakota not as hosts, but as obstacles. Elspeth had heard the talk when she rode in for supplies, whispers of savages and heathens, greedy plans to push them further from the hills where rumor said the creeks ran yellow with gold. A flicker of movement drew her eye. Not the gentle sway of the grass, but something deliberate. A shadow moving with a fluid, predatory grace along the ridge a quarter-mile north. She squinted. It was a wolf, a big one, its grey coat a perfect camouflage against the dry grass and rock. It wasn't the first she'd seen, but this one was different. It wasn't hunting, it was watching, waiting. She felt a familiar prickle of unease crawl up her spine. The old-timers said a lone wolf was a scout, a harbinger. Her father had taught her that a pack was a different kind of beast altogether, not just a group of animals, but a single thinking entity with 100 teeth and an empty stomach. She finished splitting the last log, her movements now quicker, more efficient. She stacked the wood neatly on the porch, her gaze constantly returning to the ridge. The wolf was gone, but the feeling it left behind was as cold and sharp as the wind that now whipped strands of hair across her face. Inside the cabin, the air was warm with the scent of pine smoke and drying herbs. The space was meticulously clean, a fortress of order against the chaos of the wilderness. She checked the action on the Winchester, the familiar metallic click a small comfort. She barred the heavy oak door, a precaution she never neglected, and slid the thick shutters over the 2 small windows. As twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, she sat at the small table, a bowl of rabbit stew before her, but her appetite was gone. The silence of the cabin seemed to have grown teeth. It was no longer the comfortable silence of solitude, but the tense, listening silence of a creature that knows it's being hunted. Outside, the wind howled a mournful song, and Elspeth Munro felt a profound and chilling premonition that the world she had so carefully built was about to be torn apart. The night deepened, and with it the cold. Elspeth sat wrapped in a quilt by the dying embers of the fire, the Winchester across her lap. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every creak of the logs like a whisper. It was just after midnight when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a cry, sharp, high-pitched, and filled with a terror that cut through the gale like a razor. It was the sound of a child. It was followed by a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins, the low, guttural growl of a wolf, answered by a chorus of yips and snarls from multiple directions. The pack. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct, every lesson her father had ever taught her screamed at her to stay inside, to douse the lamp, to be quiet, to be invisible. The world outside that barred door was not her concern. Survival was a selfish business. Another scream, this one choked off into a whimper. Elspeth squeezed her eyes shut. She saw her mother's face, heard her voice. "Decency, Elspeth! It's what separates us from the beasts." She thought of the whispers in Dust Devil Creek of Hiram Gantry's sneering face. They would call her a fool, or worse. Damn it all. In a single fluid motion she was on her feet. She grabbed her father's heavy bison hide coat, a powder horn and a pouch of lead balls. Shoving her feet into her worn leather boots, she unbarred the door and slipped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair and stinging her eyes with dust. The moon was a sliver offering little light, but the landscape was etched in the stark monochrome of starlight on frost. The sounds were closer now, coming from a rocky outcrop, a few hundred yards from the cabin. She could hear the frenzied snarling, the snap of jaws. She moved low and fast, using the terrain for cover, the Winchester held tight against her chest. The cold metal was a comfort, an extension of her own will. As she crested a small rise, she saw them. 6 of them. 6 grey spectres, circling in the gloom, their forms lean and hungry. And in the centre, backed against a large boulder, was a small figure. A boy, no older than 9 or 10. He was wearing buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, his black hair long and unbound. In his hand, he clutched a small, crudely made knife, his knuckles white. He was Lakota. His face was a mask of terror, but his eyes burned with defiance. He feinted with the knife as one of the wolves lunged a desperate, hopeless gesture. The lewd wolf, the big male she'd seen earlier, was creeping forward, its belly low to the ground, a deep rumble vibrating in its chest. They were done playing. Elspeth's mind raced. 6 of them. Too many to take on directly. She couldn't risk a stray shot hitting the boy. Fire. Wolves feared fire. Her satchel held a small tinder box and a piece of oilcloth. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from adrenaline, and the biting cold. She fumbled with the flint and steel, the wind threatening to extinguish the spark before it could catch. "Come on, come on!" A tiny ember glowed, and she carefully nurtured it in the folds of the oilcloth, feeding it slivers of dry grass she pulled from a protected clump at her feet. It caught. A small, precious flame flickered to life. The lead wolf lunged. The boy cried out, stumbling backward. There was no more time. Elspeth rose from her crouch. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice raw and thin against the wind. "Get away from him!" The wolves' heads snapped in her direction, 6 pairs of luminous yellow eyes fixing on her. The leader snarled, baring a set of terrifyingly white teeth. It saw her not as a threat, but as a new target. She brought the Winchester to her shoulder, took a steadying breath, and aimed just over the wolf's head, firing into the rock behind it. The roar of the rifle shattered the night. The bullet ricocheted with a high-pitched whine, and the wolf leaped back, yelping in surprise. The others scattered for a moment, confused. It was the opening she needed. She ran forward, screaming again, waving the burning oilcloth. The flame fed by the wind, and her movement roared to life, a dancing orange demon in the darkness. The wolves' instinct, overriding hunger, recoiled from the light and the heat. They snarled, frustrated and angry, but the ancient fear of man-fire was too strong. One by one they melted back into the shadows, their baleful eyes glowing for a moment before disappearing entirely. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the ragged sound of her own breathing. The burning cloth sputtered in her hand. She stood between the boy and the darkness, the rifle now feeling impossibly heavy. The Lakota boy stared at her. His defiance had crumbled, replaced by a mixture of shock, fear, and utter confusion. He was trembling, whether from cold or terror she couldn't tell. He still held the little knife, but it was pointed at the ground, now his grip slack. Slowly Elspeth lowered the Winchester. She let the burning cloth fall to the ground, where it hissed and died. She held up one empty hand, a universal sign of peace. "It's okay," she said softly, though she knew he wouldn't understand her words. "You're safe now." He didn't move. His dark eyes were huge, fixed on her face, trying to decipher the impossible why a white woman, a Washichu, would step out of the night to stand between him and the teeth of the wild. She took a slow step towards him. He flinched. She stopped. The gulf between them was more than just a few feet of frozen ground. It was a chasm of history of fear and mistrust. But tonight she had bridged it with gunpowder and fire. "Come on," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She gestured with her head back towards the faint, welcoming light of her cabin. "It's cold. Come to the light." For a long moment he remained frozen. Then, with a shudder that seemed to rack his entire small body, he took a hesitant step. Then another. He walked past her, never taking his eyes off her, and began the slow, stumbling journey towards the lonely cabin on the prairie. Elspeth watched him go, then turned to scan the darkness one last time before following the protector of a boy whose name she didn't know and whose people likely considered her an enemy. The cabin, which had felt like a prison of silence just an hour before, was now a charged and uncertain sanctuary. Elspeth bolted the door behind them, the heavy thud of the oak bar echoing the frantic beating of her own heart. The boy stood in the center of the small room, looking even smaller and more out of place against the backdrop of her settled life, the patchwork quilt on the cot, the stack of her father's books, the copper pot simmering on the hearth. He was a study in contrasts. His face was smudged with dirt and tear tracks, yet his chin was held at a proud, defiant angle. He clutched his small knife as if it were his only connection to his world. A long scratch on his forearm was beading with blood, and his leggings were torn at the knee. Elspeth moved slowly, deliberately, her every action meant to soothe. She laid the Winchester back in its place above the mantelpiece, a clear sign she intended no further violence. "Sit," she said, pointing to the small wooden stool by the fire. The boy stared at the stool, then back at her, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He did not move. He understood the gesture, but not the intent behind it. In his world, a Washichu cabin was a place of danger, not shelter. Elspeth sighed softly. This would be harder than facing the wolves. She ladled some of the warm rabbit stew into a bowl and held it out to him. His eyes darted to the food, and for the first time she saw past the fear and saw the child. His stomach betrayed him with a low rumble. Still he hesitated. She set the bowl on the table and backed away, giving him space. She then took a piece of dried venison from a pouch and ate it herself, showing him the food was safe. He watched her every move, his gaze intense. Finally, hunger won its battle with fear. He edged towards the table, snatched the bowl and retreated back to the center of the room, gulping the warm stew down so quickly he nearly choked. While he ate, Elspeth tended to the fire, adding a log and stirring the embers back to a cheerful blaze. The warmth began to fill the room, slowly thawing the frozen tension. She took a clean rag and a small pot of her mother's calendula salve. When he finished the stew, he placed the empty bowl carefully on the floor. Elspeth approached him again, slowly holding the rag and salve where he could see them. She gestured to the scratch on his arm. He flinched back, his hand tightening on his knife. His eyes flashed a warning. "Easy," she murmured, her voice a low croon, the way she would soothe a spooked horse. "Just to clean it. No hurt." She mimed, washing her own arm. He watched her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was weighing the evidence of his senses. This woman had saved him. She had fed him. Her voice was not harsh, yet everything he had ever been taught screamed that she was the enemy. He looked at the angry red line on his arm, then back at her calm, steady eyes. With a barely perceptible nod, he lowered his arm, though he did not release the knife. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned the wound with a damp, warm cloth. The boy winced but held still. As she applied the cool, soothing salve, a single tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He swiped it away angrily, embarrassed by the show of weakness. With the wound tended to, an awkward silence fell once more. Communication was a wall between them. He spoke no English, and her knowledge of Lakota was limited to a few words her father had picked up from a trapper, Washichu, white person, Paha Hills, Shunka dog. Nothing that could build a bridge. He seemed to understand this. He looked around the cabin, his eyes finally taking in the details. He saw the worn Bible on a shelf, the framed needlepoint sampler of her mother's, the carving of a hawk her father had made. His gaze lingered on the hawk. He pointed to it, then to his own chest. "Setan," he said. The word was soft but clear. "Setan," Elspeth repeated, testing the name. It felt important, giving a name to the fear. He nodded. He was Setan. "Hawk," she pointed to herself. "Elspeth." He tried to repeat it, the sounds foreign and clumsy on his tongue. A small fleeting smile touched his lips, and for a second he was just a boy, not a warrior in the making. The immediate crisis was over, but a new, more complicated one was beginning. What was she to do with him? His people would be searching. They would see her tracks leading from the site of the wolf attack to her cabin. How would they interpret what they found? A rescue or a kidnapping? And what about the people in Dust Devil Creek? If Gantry and his men found out she was sheltering a Lakota boy, They would brand her a traitor. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She pulled the thick quilt from her cot and offered it to him. She pointed to the warm space by the hearth. He understood. He wrapped the heavy quilt around his small shoulders, the unfamiliar weight and softness, a stark contrast to a buffalo robe. He sat down on the floor, his back against the warm stones of the fireplace, his little knife still resting in his lap. His eyes grew heavy, the adrenaline and fear finally giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. Within minutes, he was asleep. Elspeth watched him, a fierce, unexpected wave of protectiveness washing over her. He was just a child, lost and alone. In that moment, he wasn't Lakota, and she wasn't white. They were just two human beings in a vast, dangerous wilderness, finding shelter together. Unseen, unheard, miles away, on a wind-swept ridge overlooking the valley, two riders sat on their horses, watching the single pinprick of light from Elspeth's cabin. They had been drawn by the sound of the rifle shot. Through a spyglass they had seen it all, the woman, the wolves, the Indian boy. They had seen her lead him back to her cabin. One of the men, a lanky man named Cole, lowered the spyglass. "Well, what do you make of that Brody?" Brody, a heavier man with a perpetually sour expression, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Looks like the Monroe girl's gone and got herself a pet Indian. Gantry ain't gonna like this. Not one bit." "What are we gonna do?" Brody smiled, a cruel, thin line in the darkness. "We're gonna go tell him. Hiram Gantry knows just what to do with folks who get friendly with savages, and he knows how to make a little trouble look like a whole lot more." They turned their horses and rode south, leaving the solitary cabin to its fragile peace, unaware of the storm they were about to unleash. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in fragile shades of rose and grey. Elspeth had not slept. She'd spent the night in her father's rocking chair, the Winchester resting against her knees, watching the steady rise and fall of Sitan's chest as he slept by the fire. With the morning light came a new urgency. She had to get him home. Sitan awoke with a start, his hand immediately going to his knife. He blinked disoriented, seeing the unfamiliar log walls. Then his eyes found Elspeth, and the memory of the night before returned. He relaxed slightly, his gaze wary but no longer terrified. Elspeth offered him a piece of johnny cake, which he accepted. As they ate in silence, she tried to communicate with gestures. She pointed to him, then made a walking motion with her fingers, and then pointed west towards the Black Hills. "Home?" she asked, pointing at him. "Paha!" He seemed to understand. He nodded solemnly. He looked towards the door, a longing for his family etched onto his young face. He was ready to go. Elspeth's plan was simple and fraught with peril. She would take him to the edge of the hills, leave him where his people could find him. She couldn't risk going further into their territory. It was the best she could do. She saddled Barnaby the stout mule, making his displeasure at the early start, known with a few grumpy snorts. As she did, she scanned the prairie. Her blood ran cold. Hoofprints, two sets not her own. They were on the ridge where she had first seen the wolf, where the men had watched her. They led south in the direction of Dust Devil Creek. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Someone had seen them. The 10-mile ride to Dust Devil Creek was a journey into another world. The settlement was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen ramshackle buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery, and dominating them all, Gantry's saloon and dry goods. It was the heart of the town, and Hiram Gantry was its black, beating heart. Brody and Cole had arrived just after sunrise, their story ready. They found Gantry in his saloon, a large, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard that did nothing to soften his predatory eyes. He was counting money at the bar, the clink of coins the only sound in the empty room. "She did what?" Gantry said, his voice a low growl after they'd finished their tale. He didn't look up from his coins. "Took him right in," Brodie confirmed, leaning on the bar. "Fired on a wolf pack for him, sheltering him like he was one of her own." Gantry finally looked up, and his eyes were like chips of ice. He wasn't just a land grabber. He was a self-styled king of this small, dusty empire, and he ruled through fear. He had been quietly working to stoke the settlers' fear of the Lakota, hoping any incident would give the army a pretext to drive them from the hills, opening the land for his own claims. He'd been waiting for a spark to light the fuse, and the Monroe girl had just handed him a lit torch. "She's her father's daughter, that one," Gantry sneered. Angus Monroe always had a soft spot for the natives, filled her head with foolishness about respect. This is what it gets you. He pushed a stack of coins aside. An idea cold and brilliant was forming in his mind. The folks around here are already spooked. A lone woman living way out there. It wouldn't take much to convince them the Sioux snatched her. "But we saw her take the boy in," Cole said a bit uneasily. Gantry shot him a look that could curdle milk. "You saw what I tell you you saw. You saw a band of Sioux circling her cabin. You heard a gunshot. You rode for help. Understand?" Brodie grinned, catching on. "And when we get back there with a posse, we find the girl terrified, maybe hurt, and that little savage holding her hostage. We'd have no choice but to resolve the situation. A dead Sioux boy in a white woman's cabin. The army would be here in a week." "Exactly," Gantry said. "Spread the word. But be smart about it. Don't say it outright. Just whisper. Ask questions. Anyone seen the Monroe girl? Heard a shot from her place late last night. Saw tracks up that way. Looked like a war party. Let their fear do the work for us." By mid-morning, the poison was spreading through Dust Devil Creek. Brodie told the blacksmith that the Monroe girl hadn't come for her new mule shoes, that it wasn't like her to be late. Cole murmured to a group of anxious wives in the general store that he'd seen strange smoke signals coming from the hills near her claim. The whispers grew into a low roar of paranoia. The settlers already on edge were a tinderbox of fear. Hiram Gantry's whispers were the spark. Men began to gather in the saloon, their faces grim, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. They were farmers and prospectors, men who knew the hardness of the land, but were susceptible to the poison of fear. Gantry moved among them, his voice a balm of false concern. "I'm worried about her boys," he said, pouring a round of whiskey. "Out there all alone. It's not right. With the Sioux getting bolder every day. We ought to ride out there. Make sure she's safe." A man named Peterson, a farmer whose homestead bordered Monroe land, nodded. "My wife heard howling last night. Said it sounded like the devil's own hounds. Then a gunshot." The collective imagination of the crowd took over, fueled by whiskey and prejudice. The story solidified into a terrifying narrative. Elspeth Monroe, the sweet orphaned girl of the prairie, had been taken by a savage war party. The single gunshot was her desperate failed attempt to fight them off. They were no longer men. They were a mob. And as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the plains, Hiram Gantry stood on the saloon porch and addressed the armed group of about 15 men. "We ride now," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "We ride for Elspeth Monroe, and we'll show those savages what happens when they mess with one of our own." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. As they mounted their horses, their saddlebags filled with whiskey bottles and extra ammunition, they were blind to the truth. They weren't a rescue party. They were Gantry's pawns, a wave of misplaced fury he was about to crash down on Elspeth Munro's world, all to serve his own greedy ambition. They rode north, a dark tide of men under a darkening sky, convinced they were righteous angels of vengeance. Elspeth decided against leaving immediately. The tracks on the ridge had spooked her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that any move she made would be the wrong one. She would wait for the cover of darkness. She spent the day on edge trying to create a sense of normalcy for Seton. She showed him how to work the butter churn, a task that fascinated him. He in turn took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and drew on a spare piece of smoothed pine board. He drew his family a tall man with a spear, a woman with a baby on her back, and himself holding a small bow. A home. The simple drawing was more eloquent than any words, a heartbreaking testament to all he had lost. As evening approached, the wind died down, and an unnatural stillness fell over the prairie. The silence was heavier, more foreboding than the wind had been. Elspeth barred the door and began to prepare for their pre-dawn journey. She packed a small satchel with food and a canteen of water. Seton watched her, his expression solemn. He seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. She was checking the load in her rifle when she first smelled it. A faint, acrid scent on the still night air. Not the familiar, comforting smell of her own hearth fire, but the sharp green scent of burning prairie grass. Her heart leaped into her throat. She hurried to one of the shuttered windows, opening the peephole just a crack. Her blood ran cold. A flower of orange bloomed in the darkness about 100 yards to the east, and then another to the south, and another to the north. They were small, but they were growing, the flames greedily licking at the dry autumn grass. Someone was setting fires, a ring of fires, surrounding her cabin. Her first thought, born of instinct, and every story she'd ever heard, was of the Lakota. This was it. They had found her. They thought she had stolen their child, and this was their retribution. A siege of fire. They were going to burn her out. She turned from the window, her face pale. Seton was on his feet, his eyes wide with alarm. He could smell it, too. He ran to the peephole, and when he saw the flames, a look of pure confusion crossed his face. He looked at Elspeth, his expression a question. This wasn't the work of his people. Elspeth's mind, however, was locked in a spiral of fear. She grabbed the Winchester, her knuckles white. She was trapped with a boy whose people were at this very moment trying to kill her. The irony was so bitter it tasted like ash in her mouth. She moved from window to window, peeking through the cracks in the shutters. The fires were growing, merging. The circle was closing. The night air, once crisp and cold, was becoming thick with smoke, hazy and suffocating. The light from the flames danced eerily on the log walls of the cabin, casting long, monstrous shadows that writhed and leapt like demons. The heat was becoming noticeable, a dry, oppressive warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. Barnaby was braying in terror from the barn, the sound a frantic, desperate plea. "It's okay," she whispered more to herself than to the boy. "It's okay." But it wasn't. She looked at Seton. He was standing in the middle of the room, his small body rigid. He wasn't looking at the fire with the terror of a victim. He was looking with the critical eye of someone who understood it. He shook his head slowly, then pointed at the flames and made a gesture of chaos, of sloppiness. He then pointed to his own chest and made a different gesture, one of order, of purpose. Elspeth stared at him, not understanding. What was he trying to say? The roar of the fire was growing louder now, a hungry, consuming sound. Smoke began to seep through the cracks in the door, and the roof making her eyes water and her throat burn. Panic, cold and sharp, was beginning to pierce through her resolve. She had to do something. She couldn't just stay here and be cooked alive. She ran to the back of the cabin where a small, heavy trapdoor was set in the floor. Her father had dug a root cellar, a small, damp space to store vegetables through the winter. It wasn't much, but it was below ground. It might offer them a chance. "Here," she said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. She pulled at the heavy iron ring, grunting with the effort. The door lifted, revealing a dark, earthy-smelling hole and a short ladder. "Get in." Citan looked from the advancing flames outside to the dark hole in the floor. He hesitated for only a second before scrambling down the ladder. Elspeth grabbed the quilt, her father's book of poetry, a foolish, sentimental thing to save, but she couldn't leave it, and the water canteen. She tossed them down before descending into the darkness, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut above them. They were plunged into absolute blackness. The roar of the fire was muffled now, a distant rumbling thunder. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and potatoes. But above them they could hear the crackle and pop of a world being consumed by flame. Elspeth huddled in the dark, her arm around the trembling boy, and listened to her home, her world being destroyed. The Lakota had come for their son, and they were taking their revenge. The unfairness of it all was a physical blow. She had saved him. She had shown him kindness. And this was her reward. Despair, thick and suffocating, as the smoke above began to settle over her. She had survived the wolves, only to be consumed by the fire of men. The cellar was a tomb of cold earth and terrifying sounds. Above them, the symphony of destruction played out. They heard the frantic, desperate screams of Barnaby from the barn as the flames reached it, a sound that cut Elspeth to the core. Then, a sickening silence from that direction. They heard the pop and groan of the cabin's timbers as they heated the shatter of a glass jar on a shelf. The air grew thick and hot, and the smoke, relentless, began to find its way through the floorboards. Elspeth tore a strip from her petticoat, soaked it with precious water from the canteen, and pressed it to Citan's mouth and nose. She did the same for herself. The boy did not cry. He sat rigid, his eyes invisible in the pitch black, but she could feel the tremors that shook his body. It was in that suffocating darkness that her panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear-headed analysis. Citan's strange gestures before, they'd fled the distinction he'd made between the chaos of this fire and the way of his own people played over and over in her mind. Why would a war party skilled in the arts of stealth and attack be so clumsy? Why surround the cabin with a ring of fire that could be seen for miles, alerting anyone, settlers, patrols, other tribes, to their presence? It was a spectacle, not a tactic. An attack by the Lakota would have been swift, silent, and final. An arrow through the window, a rush on the door. Not this. This loud, wasteful, cowardly circle. And then she remembered the tracks on the ridge, the tracks leading south. It's not them, she realized, the thought, so sharp and certain it was like a physical blow. It's not the Lakota. It was Gantry. It had to be. This wasn't a fire of revenge. It was a fire of deception. He wasn't trying to kill her, not yet. He was trapping her. He was creating a scene. He would ride in tomorrow with his posse of frightened farmers, the heroic rescuer, and find her half mad with fear. He'd save her from the Lakota boy, painting himself the hero and cementing the settlers' fear and hatred of the natives. The boy Citan would be the proof, the scapegoat. No one would question the story. A dead Lakota boy, a terrified white girl, and a burned-out homestead. It was the perfect pretext for war. The cold dread that filled her was worse than the heat from the fire. She had stumbled into a trap far more insidious than a wolf pack's jaws. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the flames. Shouting, the thunder of hoofbeats. Not the wild, ululating cries she imagined a war party would make, but the coarse shouts of white men. "Circle around, don't let 'em escape. She's in there, the savages got her." It was Gantry's posse. They were here. The trap was closing. Elspeth held Citan tighter, her mind racing. If they were found in the cellar, Gantry's men would kill Citan on sight. They would drag her out, and her version of the story would be drowned in their righteous fury. But the fire Gantry's weapon was now her only shield. The men wouldn't approach the cabin until the flames died down. That gave her time. A little, but maybe enough. Then another sound joined the cacophony, a sound that made the hair on Elspeth's arms stand up, a deep, resonant call that echoed from the west, from the direction of the Black Hills. It was answered by another and another. It was not the sound of an attack, but of a search party. A signal. Seaton heard it, too. He stiffened in her arms, and for the first time he made a sound, a soft, hopeful cry, like a lost lamb, hearing its mother. "8," he whispered into the darkness. "Father." Outside, the situation had become a tinderbox. Gantry and his 15 men had arrived to find the prairie ablaze, just as he'd planned. They formed a loose perimeter, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow, their rifles ready. They were waiting for the fire to burn itself out around the cabin, ready to play the part of rescuers. "Hold your positions!" Gantry yelled, his voice filled with false bravado. "They're trapped in there. We'll get 'em at first light." But from the west, a line of riders appeared, silhouetted against the glow of the distant flames. They were not a chaotic mob, but a disciplined line of warriors, their movements fluid and controlled. There were perhaps 20 of them, moving without a sound, save the soft thud of their ponies' hooves on the scorched earth. At their head rode a man of immense presence, his face grim, and set his eyes, scanning the fiery scene with piercing intelligence. This was Matowanagi Ghost Bear Citan's father, and a respected leader of his people. They had followed their son's trail, and it had led them to this nightmare. Gantry's men saw them. A ripple of fear and excitement went through the posse. "It's them, the war party," someone shouted. "Get ready, boys. Pick your targets," Brody yelled, leveling his rifle. Gantry held up a hand. "Hold your fire. Not yet. Let them get closer. We want everyone to see them threatening this place. We need witnesses." The two groups faced each other across a landscape lit by the dying fires, a no-man's land of smoldering grass and swirling ash. The Lakota warriors sat on their horses, silent and watchful, their spears and bows a stark contrast to the settlers' rifles. Matawanagi's gaze was fixed on the cabin at the center of the inferno, his heart a cold stone in his chest. His son was in there. Elspeth in the cellar could feel the shift. The shouting had changed in tone, and the new organized calls of the Lakota signaled a fundamental change in the situation. She was no longer just caught in Gantry's trap. She was caught between two fires, the simmering hatred of the settlers and the cold, unknown fury of the Lakota. And she was in the middle in the dark, with the one thing both sides wanted the boy. Dawn was coming, and with it a reckoning. The heat in the cellar was becoming unbearable. The air was thin and tasted of soot. Elspeth knew they couldn't stay hidden for much longer. The fire around the cabin had burned a wide black circle and was now dying down to smouldering embers. The moment of confrontation was at hand. "Setan!" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "We have to go out." "8," she said, using the word he had spoken. "Father." She pointed upwards. He understood. He nodded, his small face a mask of grim determination. He trusted her. That single fact gave Elspeth a sliver of courage. She pushed open the heavy trapdoor. Smoke, thick but cooler now, billowed in. They scrambled up the ladder and into the ruin of her home. The roof was gone in places open to the pre-dawn sky, which was a bruised purple and grey. Embers glowed like angry red eyes in the charred timbers. Everything was black, broken, or gone. A wave of grief washed over her, but there was no time for it. Through the gaping hole where the door had been, she could see the scene, arrayed like a terrible tableau. To the south, Gantry and his men, dismounted now, forming a ragged line. To the west, the silent, imposing figures of the Lakota warriors. In the center, her ruined cabin, a smoking funeral pyre. She took a deep breath. She took Sitan's hand. His small hand squeezed hers tightly. Together they walked out of the smoldering remains of the cabin and into the center of the standoff. A collective gasp went through the posse. There she was, the Monroe girl, alive. Filthy, covered in soot, but alive. And with her, the Indian boy. "See!" Gantry roared, seizing the moment. "He had her. The savage took her. We're just in time. Get the boy." Several of Gantry's men raised their rifles. On the other side, Matowanagi saw his son, alive, holding the white woman's hand. His warriors tensed. Arrows were knocked to bowstrings, lances lowered. They saw a woman who had taken their child, and a circle of armed men ready to fire. "No!" Elspeth screamed, her voice tearing through the tense silence. She thrust Sitan behind her, shielding him with her own body, and held up a hand to both sides. "Stop." She looked at Gantry's men, at the faces of the settlers she knew. Peterson the farmer, O'Connell the blacksmith, men manipulated by fear. "You don't understand," she shouted, her voice cracking. "He didn't take me. I saved him from a wolf pack. He was lost." "She's lying," Brody yelled. "They've twisted her mind." Gantry took a step forward, his face a mask of concern that fooled no one. "Elspeth, child, step away from the savage. We'll take care of you. We're here to save you." "Save me." Elspeth's grief and terror erupted into pure, cleansing rage. You did this." She pointed a trembling, soot-stained finger at Gantry. "This wasn't the Lakota. This was you. I saw the tracks of your men yesterday. You set these fires." A murmur of confusion went through the posse. They looked from Elspeth's accusing face to Gantry's confident sneer. "The girl is hysterical," Gantry said smoothly. "Grief-stricken. Look what they've done to her home." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Elspeth's raw sincerity was more powerful than Gantry's smooth lies. She then turned to face Matowanagi. The warrior's face was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on her. She knew no words to bridge this gap. She had to rely on the truth. She let go of Sitan's hand. She pushed him gently forward. "Sitan," she said softly, "go to your father." The boy ran, a small, desperate figure crossing the no-man's land. He threw himself into his father's arms. Matowanagi swept him up onto his horse, holding him tight, checking him for injuries, his stoic facade cracking for a moment, with overwhelming relief. Seton began speaking rapidly in Lakota, his high-pitched voice telling the story of the night. He pointed to the west where the wolves had attacked. He pointed to Elspeth and made a gesture of a rifle firing. He pointed to the ashes of the cabin and made a gesture of shelter and food. Then, his face hardening, he pointed directly at Hiram, Gantry, Brody, and Cole, and made the gesture of fire, a circle in the air with his finger. The truth, spoken in a language Gantry's men couldn't understand, was now clear to the Lakota. Matawanagi's eyes shifted to Gantry, and they burned with a cold, righteous fury. "It's a trick!" Gantry shouted, seeing he was losing control. "They're all in on it. Fire, boys! Fire now!" But his men hesitated. They looked at the boy safe in his father's arms. They looked at the fierce, desperate honesty in Elspeth's face. They looked at Gantry's sweaty, panicked expression. It didn't add up. At that critical moment, A new rider appeared, cresting the hill from the east. An old man on a cantankerous-looking mule, a long Kentucky rifle resting in the crook of his arm. It was Zebulon Pike, a grizzled old prospector who had been Angus Monroe's best friend. He had seen the glow in the sky from his camp miles away and had ridden hard. "What in God's name is going on here?" Zebulon's voice was like gravel rolling downhill. He was a man respected by the settlers, known for his honesty and his utter lack of fear. "Zeb," Peterson called out, relieved. "Gantry said the Sioux took Elsie." Zebulon's eyes scanned the scene. He saw Elspeth the Lakota and Gantry. He knew Hiram Gantry for the snake he was. "Gantry's a liar and a thief," Zebulon stated not as an opinion, but as a fact. "And if Elsie says he set this fire, then he set this fire. I'd stake my life on that girl's word before I'd trust a single breath from Gantry's lungs." That was it. The spell was broken. Zebulon's simple, powerful endorsement of Elspeth shattered Gantry's web of lies. The settlers lowered their rifles, their faces a mixture of confusion, shame, and dawning anger at being manipulated. Gantry saw it was over. His plan had crumbled into ash, his face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He raised his own pistol, aiming it squarely at Elspeth. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me, you little traitor!" He never fired. An arrow, silent and impossibly fast, flew from Mattawanagi's bow. It struck Gantry in the shoulder, spinning him around with a scream of pain. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the sky. Before anyone else could react, 2 Lakota warriors surged forward, dragging the whimpering Brody and a terrified Cole from their horses. Mattawanagi walked his horse forward until he stood before Elspeth. He looked down at her, his face no longer angry, but filled with a deep, profound respect. He said a sentence in Lakota, his voice soft. Zebulon Pike translated his own voice, filled with awe. "He calls you woman who fights the fire. He says you have a strong heart." Mattawanagi reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a single eagle feather tied with a strip of blue beadwork. He leaned down and offered it to her. Elspeth, trembling, took it. It was a gift of honor, a symbol of immense courage, a bridge across the chasm of hate. Mattawanagi gave a sharp command. His warriors released the now sobbing Brody and Cole, shoving them towards the bewildered settlers. They tied the wounded, moaning Gantry to his own saddle. Then, with a final solemn nod to Elspeth, Mattawanagi turned his horse and led his people with his son safe, before him, back towards the sanctuary of the Black Hills. As the sun finally rose, it illuminated a scene of quiet reckoning. The settlers, ashamed and angry, surrounded Gantry and his men. Elspeth Monroe stood alone in the ashes of her home, clutching an eagle feather, the smoke rising around her like a prayer. She had lost everything she owned, but she had saved a life, exposed a liar, and earned a name. She was no longer just a frontier girl. She was the woman who fights the fire. In the wild and unforgiving West, stories weren't just told. They were forged in fire, paid for, in loss, and written on the heart. Elspeth Monroe lost her home that day, but what rose from the ashes was something far stronger. She became a legend, a quiet testament to the fact that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. Her story reminds us that the deepest divides between cultures, between people, can be bridged not by grand treaties or loud declarations, but by a single decent act in the dark. It shows us that the most dangerous fires are not the ones that burn our homes, but the ones of hatred and prejudice that we allow to burn in our hearts. If this story of the frontier stirred something in you, help us keep these legends alive. hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a true tale of the West, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of the forgotten heroes and untold trials of the American frontier. Thank you for listening.